My name is Ada Simpson. I'm Head of Quality Early Years Settings at the Department for Education. And, as Matthew and the Minister have said, today's session is all about wellbeing, and what bigger message could we start with than a really, really big thank you. And whether you work in a nursery, a school, or as a childminder, or in a local authority, a charity, or another early years organisation, we wanted to say on behalf of all of us officials at the DFE, thank you to each of you. Thank you for absolutely everything that you have done and that you are doing to keep children safe in what has really been a remarkably difficult year. And not only that, of course, as the Minister and Matthew said, it's also everything you do to support and look after your colleagues as well. We know it has been a challenging year. We also know that many challenges remain and there are uncertainties ahead. And whilst the news of an effective COVID vaccine, well, vaccines even, is promising, it will be some time before things feel more normal again. And so we hope that today is useful, and that through the dedicated sessions on children and staff wellbeing, or even through the chance to speak to some colleagues in the breakout session, or even if it just gives you a chance today to spend some time reflecting on your own wellbeing challenges and needs for you personally or in your place of work, we hope that that's a useful thing today. As Matthew said, it is a bit different doing this digitally, and normally we'd all be in a room together and sharing a cup of tea and perhaps enjoying a biscuit. But we know everybody at NCB and all involved have worked really hard to try and make this an engaging and useful session. So I hope people feel that it is. And in terms of COVID, we know obviously that the Prime Minister has announced that the lockdown will end on the 2nd of December, and that we are expecting to hear actually from the Health Secretary today about what tiers each local area will go into. And we realise that will bring different pressures for people, irrespective really of what tier people might find themselves in. We will be publishing updated early years guidance, and largely things will remain the same for early years providers, in that irrespective of which tier they're in, they will be able to remain open, as will wraparound provision as well, of course, following the appropriate safety measures. So really today, what we wanted to do in this slot was talk a little bit about the EYFS reforms, which are going to be statutory from September next year, to give a couple of reminders and also to comment on how we see the reforms as being able to help support wellbeing of staff in settings as well as children. Now, I know some people know more than others about the reforms. We do still get some of these questions, so we thought it would be useful to recap for people who might not be as familiar. The overarching aims of the reforms are to improve outcomes for all children at age 5. And that's particularly for disadvantaged children, because we really need to focus on closing that persistent gap in outcomes for children from more disadvantaged backgrounds. So, for example, in 2019, 57% of children who are eligible for free school meals achieved a good level of development, and that compares to 74%, a much higher number of other children achieving a good level of development. So we hope that these reforms can be one part of supporting the work to address that gap. And the other underpinning aim of the reforms, as the Minister has said, is about reducing practitioner and teacher workload. We want to enable teachers and practitioners to spend more time with interacting with children in their care and delivering the holistic curriculum that supports their learning and development, rather than spending excessive amounts of time caught up in paperwork, which we are told happens in some places. And we hear from child development experts that it really is spending that time with children and cutting down on paperwork and so on that takes you away from spending time with children that can make the difference for them, as well as for hopefully the way that teachers and practitioners feel. So the key changes to the early years foundation stage are changes to the educational programmes, which are the curriculum elements, and early learning goals, which are to strengthen those, and they include more information on self-care and supporting children to be healthy. There are also 2 changes to the assessment requirements in the EYFS around the EYFS profile assessment that happens at the end of the reception year. One of those changes is the removal of the exceeding criteria to focus on supporting all children to reach the expected level, and also the removal of statutory moderation by local authorities. The other change is around oral health, which is in the third section of the EYFS, and explicitly promoting children's good oral health. You can find out more information on gov.uk about what the changes are for people who would want a bit more info. There is an early adoption year going ahead at the moment. Over 3,000 schools volunteered to take part in early adoptions of the reform a year ahead of statutory rollout from next September. I think it's important to say that this isn't a test year. The EYFS has been finalised, but we are really keen to seek feedback from early adopters and from others, such as yourselves attending today, during the course of this year, so that we can refine our approach to supporting implementation of the reforms and to hear thoughts on what we can do to help people in all different types of providers to implement the reforms. I thought it'd be helpful to mention some of the support that will be coming for statutory rollouts. The revised EYFS framework will be available, which will include also some minor changes to safeguarding and welfare requirements. There will be the revised handbook, which will actually include the assessment and reporting arrangements. There will be new exemplification materials for those who need to assess children against the early learning goals in the profile assessment. There's the new development matters. There will be a range of webinars for practitioners, teachers, and also crucially for head teachers as well, because we hear the feedback that it's important that head teachers and leaders hear these messages and these changes as well. We are working hard to make online support materials available for pre-reception settings, including childminders. And we have already provided detailed information to local authorities, and we'll be providing virtual training events for them early in 2021. Some aspects of this support and the things that we have planned have already been affected by COVID in terms of needing to do more things digitally, and in terms of implications for things like creating video content, for instance, for the new ELG exemplifications. We are working really hard to try and get everything ready and in place, but there may be some things that are a bit different to what we had in mind as a result of COVID. So that was a sort of overview of the EYFS reforms. Moving on to some of the key messages we wanted to share around workload and what we hear about the importance of managing workload as a way to support wellbeing for staff in the early years sector. So as we've been referencing, we really do want the EYFS reforms to help tackle some of the drivers of excessive burdens in the sector. And as part of that, we do encourage the sector, where this happens, to move away from unhelpful tracking practices, which can contribute to excessive burdens. We say that people don't need to track children to the early learning goals throughout the reception year, or indeed prior to the reception year, and the ELGs are just for that profile assessment at the end of the reception year. We know that lots of excessive tracking can lead to heavy workload burdens and lots of paperwork, including ticking things off against tick lists, when really what we all want to be doing is focusing on children's learning and development. I wanted to reference here also the new development matters, which has been set up to also help tackle this excessive tracking culture where it exists, and also to focus on people's professional judgment and being able to rely on that instead of collecting lots of evidence and paperwork. So for that reason, the new development matters deliberately excludes reference to the ELGs to avoid tracking against those, and the age bands have been condensed from 6 to 3. And the idea behind that is that hopefully it allows more focus on really securing children's learning instead of trying to tick items off as quickly as possible. We have also heard people say that sometimes additional bands can be set up to measure children against, either additional sort of performance bands or age bands, and we would also advise against that as well, because based on what, again, child development experts say, it's not necessary to place children regularly into different bands. So there is, as Matthew mentioned, a webinar on foundation years about the revised, some really useful tips around some ideas about how to reduce excessive tracking and so on. We also wanted to mention that this is a message that both DfE and Ofsted are trying to share together over the coming years, because we both agree that this kind of tracking and excessive data gathering for EYFS profile assessments and other purposes isn't necessary. So we hope that's helpful to enforce, and as I say, our other support plans during the year will also be sharing that message far and wide, including with head teachers. So thanks for listening, and I'll pass back over to Matthew.